Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi everybody, Tom Woods here. It is episode 2686 of The Tom Woods Show, and I'm delighted to welcome our friend Dan Flynn, our new friend. You know, we sort of known of each other, but he's now a friend of The Tom Woods Show, having been a guest, and he is the author of the brand new book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. And I'll tell you something, Dan, when I was in college, I got really interested in the history of conservatism and libertarianism. So, of course, I read that George Nash book, you know, the history of what was the history of conservative intellectuals in America in 1945?
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Intellectual movement since 1945.
Conservative intellectual movement, that's right. And that book, you know, even if you don't necessarily agree with his different categories, that really gives you a lot of good grounding in some of the names, the events, the books, the ideas. And once I started there, then I wanted to read some of the books that were referred to in there. So I read In Defense of Freedom by Frank Meyer. And you can be assured, Dan, that it was sitting there untouched on the library shelf, just waiting for me to read it. No one else had chosen to take it out. So I want to start off, though, with, first of all, let me explain to everybody. Frank Meyer is a figure of enormous importance. And if this is not a name that rings a bell, I know there are many other things you could do with your time. As John Stossel told me once when I was about to be on his show, he said, look, there are a lot of TV channels out there, and some of them have dancing girls on them. So we have to be really interesting, or otherwise people. So what I'm saying is, watch the dancing girls later. You're going to like learning about Frank Meyer. I want to start with the fantastic story that must warm the heart of every scholar of how you track down a major chunk of the Frank Meyer papers. It's right at the beginning of your book, and it looked like to all the world that there was a big missing chunk of these papers, and well, there's just nothing you can do as a biographer of Frank Meyer, but you were not going to accept that answer.
No, I'm a strange person, and I think with my research, I can be a little bit overbearing. And so a couple things happened. COVID happened, and it shut down all of the archives across the United States. And the second thing that happened was I sent in a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request to the federal government, and they sent me a note. I sent that in 2021. They sent me a note back in 2022, and they said, well, we're just now processing requests from 2014, but since COVID happened, yours is going to take a little while longer. In other words, check back with us in the 2030s. There you go for government efficiency. And I was in a very desperate spot. I had heard that Frank's papers were at Stanford at the Hoover Institution, which truth be told, I'm now a visiting fellow of the Hoover Institution.
Oh, that's great.
And when I looked at what they had there, a lot of it was a lot of it was like stuff that you would issue files, stuff that you would before the internet. Probably you wrote before the internet, and you probably kept files. Like if you were writing on the IRS, you'd keep a file on the IRS. And if you wrote on the IRS 2 years later, you'd refer to that file for context. That's a lot of what they had was that. And if you're a biographer, that's about the least important information of what someone would clip from the newspaper. So I started calling people and saying, hey, do you contemporaries of Frank's, or, people that were at least in his orbit, do you have any material related to Frank? And I got some letters concerning In Defense of Freedom, his big book. I got property documents regarding his house up in Woodstock. I got some letters from Wilmore Kendall talking about Frank, but this was not the kind of stuff that you would be able to write a biography. And so I went in search of, I thought his real papers aren't at Hoover. I've been doing this for 25 years. There's sort of a rhythm to archives. It's not always the same rhythm, but there's usually a rhythm. And the lack of his letters there, the lack of his tax returns, things that someone would normally keep in the mid-20th century, I thought this stuff's got to be out there somewhere. And I kept looking. And after about 2 years, his oldest son, John, said, well, we did sell the house and all of its contents to this couple. And I said, well, why didn't you tell me that in our first conversation, John? I called the couple. They said, "Oh no, or at least the guy said, we donated it all to Hoover." And I said, "No, you didn't." And he said, "No, we did." I said, "No, I'm not accusing you of withholding anything. I just know that you forgot to donate it all. You have some of it." And this went on for a little while, and I softened him up, and ultimately he revealed that he had a warehouse. And I was like, "Take me to your warehouse." Like, who has a warehouse? They had bought the Meyer home, which it's not a small home, but they bought it not to live in, but to store all their books. So they were different breed of cat, these two. And so finally, in August of 2022, I was able to go to this warehouse, and the guy said, "Well, there's 1,000 boxes. You couldn't look through it all." I said, No, I will look through it all." It took me 3 days. There were actually 663 boxes. I went through every single one of them. I opened them, I inspected them, I retaped them, I restacked them on the pallets. And of those 663 boxes, 15 contained Frank Meyer's papers. So we're talking about letters from Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and J. Edgar Hoover and Joan Didion. There's over 1,000 letters between Wilmer Kendall and Frank Meyer. There's over 1,000 letters between Brent Bazell. There's about 1,000 letters from William F. Buckley. There's hundreds of letters from Barry Goldwater. There's all sorts of material that nobody has ever seen before. Most of it, some of the Buckley stuff exists in duplicate, but most of it appears in duplicate nowhere else. And so I hit the mother lode here. If you want to write an original book, it really helps when you have material. It's not even archival material. It's stuff that's not in any archive. No other scholar has access to it. And so I think for people that are reading The Man Who Invented Conservatism, it's pretty obvious when you're reading it that, gee, I haven't heard this story before. This is a little different. And it necessarily gives you a different take on the post-war conservative movement because it's so much material that you're having friends talking to other friends. They tell each other stuff that they're not going to say William F. Buckley, their boss.
First of all, I have to say, I would have given up. I would have thought, well, look, these people are insisting that, nope, they turned everything over and I should look elsewhere for the papers. But your persistence, and it paid off. You found these papers, so now your book is indeed going to tell us things about this moment in our intellectual history that we did not know before, and it was because of your persistence on this. So I'm glad you were a stickler and wouldn't take no for an answer. So we all collectively thank you for that.
It's also this couple saved history. They kept it. They were kind of pack rats. And most people would have, it's called ephemera for a reason, right? People throw it away, and they didn't treat it as ephemera. They kept it. And so I think most of the glory goes to them. But yes, am I a little persistent and overbearing with stuff? Yeah, I am.
Well, let's try to situate this for a minute by maybe if you could take a minute or two to explain to people why Frank Meyer matters. Why are we devoting an episode to this man? We're devoting it to him and the ideas he represented and the people he knew, but why, of all people, Frank Meyer?
I think Frank Meyer, the part of his story that people don't realize is that before he became conservative organizer extraordinaire, he was that for communists. He really was the Johnny Appleseed of communism in Great Britain. He was, in the material that I got from British intelligence, and there's about 160 pages of material, he is called in those documents repeatedly the founder of the Student Communist Party movement in Great Britain. And if you think of all that came out of that, like Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, very little of it good. The Oxford Pledge, so much that came out of that movement that Frank started, he was a rather significant figure. In the papers themselves, there's shocking stories about Frank's accomplishments over in Great Britain. I don't put it like this. Frank was a revolutionary. He wanted to violently overthrow the government of Great Britain. And at the same time, he is advocating that. He is engaging in a surreptitious relationship with Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald's youngest daughter, Sheila MacDonald. Now, I don't know of Lenin or Mao or Pol Pot or any other revolutionary, Che Guevara, pulling off a caper such as this. But the idea that you're going to be such a public face of the Communist Party, and at the same time, one of the letters I got from the warehouse, it's from Sheila MacDonald. She's saying, come over, 7:00. My father's not at home. The coast is clear. Come on over to 10 Downing Street. That's pretty radical thing to do, pretty brash thing to do. but that was Frank Meyer. Unsurprisingly, he got deported from the United Kingdom not long thereafter. And unsurprisingly, Sheila MacDonald writes him and says, hey, is there anything I can do? Can I intervene? She couldn't. The point there is that Frank had charisma. Frank had, people were attracted to this guy. The Prime Minister's daughter was attracted to him. And Frank was a guy who took chances. That same charisma that brought him such a following in the United Kingdom and also in the United States as a communist, later when he became a conservative, he was able to get people around him. He was president at the creation of National Review. He was a founder of the American Conservative Union. He was at the founding meeting of the Young Americans for Freedom. He certainly influenced the Sharon Statement probably more than anyone else that Stan Evans wrote. He was he was a founding father of the Conservative Party of New York. He was all sorts of, the Philadelphia Society would be another organization. So his fingerprints are all over the post-war right. And I think what's interesting about him is that he had his hands in multiple cookie jars. I mean, he was very close, and this is going to come out in some articles that I write, extremely close to Murray Rothbard. He was mentored by Rose Wilder Lane. So there's this libertarian side of him. He was, the Volcker Fund funded so much of his work. So there was this libertarian side to him, but he was also obviously at National Review for 17 years as their literary editor, but also as kind of their chief ideologist in books, in Principles and Heresies, his regular column there. So he had this hand in the conservative cookie jar too. And ultimately his life project was this thing called fusionism. And we can talk about that later. And I've sort of uncovered the origins of fusionism, which may or may not be inconvenient to people. But fusionism, he wanted to bring together libertarians and traditionalists. And his idea basically was that the tradition of America was the American founding, and the meaning of the founding was freedom. So therefore, our tradition is sort of a tradition of liberty. And that's its sort of distilled form. In more complex form, like a book like Stan Evans wrote, The Theme is Freedom. That was sort of fusionism applied, where he said that, we have thousands of years of tradition of Western civilization, and freedom rests on that. And if you take that away, freedom will be in trouble. So Meyer's point was that freedom and tradition are in cooperation. They're not in conflict. And a lot of people disagreed with that. Some agreed with it. But I think ultimately it was appealing to enough people that from Barry Goldwater through Ronald Reagan, it was kind of the default position of conservative intellectuals. Obviously now things are a little bit different. But in those years, fusionism was something that was so influential that even people that had never heard the term fusionism were sort of fusionists. They had never heard the name Frank Meyer, but they were following what he had instructed.
Hey, everybody, if you're worried, and you should be, about the value of your hard-earned savings getting eaten away by inflation, trade wars, or reckless Fed policy, it's time to secure and grow your wealth in something they can't inflate away, and that's gold. But a lot of gold owners just buy gold and then let it sit there collecting dust, and then they feel like they're missing out on the growth happening in other asset classes. That's why I lease my gold with Monetary Metals. I can earn a 4% annual yield paid in gold every single month while still owning my ounces. Again, the yield you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold, which you get in addition to any price appreciation from gold during the year, which, as you know, continues to break all-time highs in 2025. So join me and thousands of happy clients who are earning a gold income every single month. This is a no-brainer for those looking to earn an honest return in honest money. The Fed can print dollars, they can't print gold. Now's the time for you to start growing your wealth in ounces. Go to monetary-metals.com/woods to learn more. That's monetary-metals.com/woods. Of course, I want to talk about fusionism because that's something that I care about a lot. I think there's reason for overlap between conservatives and libertarians, but it depends on what kind of conservative and what kind of libertarian, and I think there are good grounds for that. Well, let me ask, first of all, why, if you're going to call him the man who invented conservatism, now that his fusionism was controversial. Not everybody rallied to it by any means. So to posit him as the creator of American conservatism requires some justification, especially when people might be more inclined to claim Russell Kirk because of his book, The Conservative Mind. So what's wrong with that way of thinking? Why Frank Meyer?
Well, I think that the title has kind of a double meaning. And part of it is that Frank came over from communism. And communist people on the left, they're all about systems. And I think in Frank's mind, you had to create a system to beat a system. And so he thought he would invent conservatism. And of course, conservatism is not something to be invented, it's something to develop organically. And I think it took a while for Frank to figure that out. So, in that sense, it has a meaning that's, I don't want to say it's an insulting meaning to Frank, but it's poking fun a little bit at his earlier stage. But I think beyond that, in a more direct sense, he is, like I just said in the previous segment, the guy that was a part of all of this skeletal structure of the conservative movement, who was at National Review from the beginning, who, whether you're talking about activism or intellectual stuff, Frank was at the center of it from 1950 until his death in 1972. So in that sense, that conservative movement that came out of post-Roosevelt, and the way Frank would have described it is, well, the uniting feature of all of the people on the right in the post-war years was a desire to, not for a revolution, but to restore what had been prior to Roosevelt, to basically overturn the New Deal. And beyond that, there's all sorts of disagreements, but pretty much all of them kind of agreed on that. Now, what had happened, you mentioned Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk wrote The Conservative Mind, and of course, he was initially wanted to title that book The Conservative Rout, because the pre-war conservatives, the old right, those people were routed. There were some of them around. I taught Rose Wilder Lane, of course. She was a mentor. She was the mentor to Frank Meyer on the right. That's something that people are going to get from my book that they wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. There were people like that, and Garrett Garrett, John T. Flynn, and Albert J. Nock. And some of those people were still around, Frank Chodorov. But they had been routed. They had very little power. Lane, of course, was such an enemy of the New Deal that she didn't even want to get a Social Security number. So she was very restrained in where she could write, because she had to make these odd arrangements where she was paid in such a way that she didn't have to give her tax information because she didn't want a Social Security number. So these were people that didn't have a whole lot of power after the Second World War. So it was going to have to start anew, in a sense. And that's a weird thing for conservatives. They're going to have to start anew, that there was a continuity that was broken up. And that's why you have all these people come out of the woodwork, like Kirk, like Meyer, like William F. Buckley, that were nobodies a few years before, but then all of a sudden they are, they're kind of shot callers within the conservative milieu.
Now I want to bring up the Murray Rothbard question here, partly because my listeners have a lot of interest in it, and because that Rothbard has an essay about fusionism from decades ago.
Sure,
and his argument was that fusionism is really just libertarianism dressed up. It's really, because he says the key dividing line between the libertarians and the traditionalists had to do with encouraging virtue among the population. And the question was, what mechanisms are we going to use to carry that out? Because there are non-coercive mechanisms you can use to carry that out. And very few people are going to say, we don't want to have a virtuous public. The question is, how do we arrive at that? And Rothbard quotes Frank Meyer as saying, if freedom is indeed the essence of man's being, that which distinguishes him from the beasts, he must be free to choose his worst as well as his best end. Unless he can choose his worst, he cannot choose his best. And so Rothbard's argument was, that's libertarianism. That's just libertarianism plus a rhetorical concern for virtue. Now, was he right or wrong about that?
I think he was mostly right. I have a little portion of my book where I talk about people interpreting Meyer. And John East says he was a Christian theorist. There's another guy who says he's a traditionalist. There's Murray who says he's a libertarian. There's someone else. Paul Gottfried said at essence he was an anti-communist. So Frank, in his book In Defense of Freedom, not to be heretical, but it's a little bit like the Bible in the sense there's a million different interpretations of it, and you have to kind of figure out which one is right. I think Murray's probably more right than wrong. Part of Murray looking at that is Frank and Murray were very close. They were the two people that were employed by the Volcker Fund in the 1950s and into the 1960s to review scholarship. So they were basically reviewing not only academic articles, but they were reviewing books and saying, this book is terrible, this guy is great, this person has got some good ideas. and they were telling Volcker, and then Volcker would figure out who they were going to fund and who they weren't going to fund. And they were the only two people employed in that capacity at Volcker. Meyer came down, and some of this stuff is going to be new to people because it's in these letters that I found between Meyer and Rothbard. Meyer came down and spoke to Circle Bastiat in, I think, 1954 or 1950, mid 1950s at some point. They would talk on the phone, Meyer and Rothbard. Meyer was rather crucial in the publication of Man, Economy, and State, that behind Rothbard's back, the Volcker Fund went to Meyer and said, what do you think? Should this be published or should it not be published? And then, of course, and this is the article that I have coming out in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, not to get into it too deeply, but there's some rather important correspondence between Rothbard and Meyer with regard to Ayn Rand. And Meyer was Rothbard's sounding board on Rand. He went to Meyer and said, hey, she's completely crazy or she's completely brilliant. And depending upon the month, according to Murray, she was either completely brilliant or completely crazy. And so he went to Meyer with this information. And that's going to be coming out soon. And so these guys were pretty close. And I have a letter from Murray after Meyer's death where he's basically mourning the guy. And when you think about people that didn't always agree politically, it's very rare think about Murray, think about when Murray died, and think about the obit in National Review that Bill Buckley wrote. It was kind of nasty, right? And so sometimes people that clash, by the time someone dies, they're not going to send them a sort of a nice goodbye. Murray thought the world of Frank. These two loved each other. So I think part of that, Murray is going to look at Frank and say, yeah, he was one of us. Now, I think he happened to be mostly right. But if you look, I think the thing that bothered Murray mostly about Frank is Frank was a hardcore anti-communist. Now, it's a little bit misleading. He was certainly an anti-communist. But when Henry Kissinger wrote Frank, and again, this is from the collection that I found, he basically said, listen, Frank, I'm going to be the national security advisor in Richard Nixon's White House. This is December of 1968. What should our foreign policy be? And Frank said, well, of course, there is this messianic crusader state that we should stand up to wherever they go and not let them take any more. However, this is a disorienting force on our foreign policy. If this crusader state, the Soviet Union, if it were absent, the idea of foreign aid, the idea of United Nations, the idea of a war in Vietnam, all of this stuff would be a farce. We're only doing this because there is this menace, the Soviet Union. And so, as strange as it sounds, Murray and Frank had very similar views on foreign policy. The difference is that as long as there was going to be a Soviet Union in the world, Frank was not going to be out anti-communist by someone else. Murray obviously retained that sort of old right view, and he was very critical of Meyer's anti-communism. And Meyer's anti-communism was such that, he entertained the idea of a preemptive first strike on the Soviet Union with regard to nuclear weapons. He was what I would call a Sputnik truther for a few years. He believed these people were such liars that they probably made up Sputnik. And so Frank, even Frank's anti-communism was off-putting even to Whittaker Chambers. I'll put it like that. So I think on that issue, Murray and Frank parted company, but even their parting of company on that issue, Frank had some views that were very similar to Murray's on foreign policy. They just couldn't really be expressed during the Cold War.
Just as a little point of information for anybody who may not know, you mentioned a couple times now the Volcker Fund. The Volcker Fund is the group of people who funded Ludwig von Mises' salary because he had an unpaid position at NYU. It was the Volcker Fund that basically arranged for him to be paid. And then, as you say, with these book reviews, the Mises Institute some years ago released a collection of Rothbard's Volcker Fund memos called Strictly Confidential. And these book reviews are so detailed, and they were never really meant to be seen by anyone except the small group of people at the Volcker Fund. And there's some American history textbook I cannot remember in there. Rothbard has, I don't know, it's got to be a 30-page takedown of it. And it's so detailed. And the poor authors of this book, you almost feel sorry for them. And that was one of the things that impressed me about Rothbard. I would find these articles by him that would be in some obscure investment newsletter that had 400 subscribers, never intended to see a broader light of day. And now, thanks to the internet, they can have that light of day. But staying to our subject here, at what point does Meyer become like a known figure in the conservative intellectual world? Like, what is his entry point? I mean, wasn't the fusionism stuff came later?
Yes. Okay, so he has a friend named Robert Phelps, who is a very talented writer, but is, like a lot of talented writers, he's not known at all these days. And Phelps starts writing for a publication called The Freeman. And he says to Meyer, why don't you come and join me? And Meyer starts contributing articles to The Freeman. Most of them are book reviews. And basically what happens at The Freeman is you have this triumvirate of editors at that time, which was Susan La Follette, Forrest Davis, and the third was the most famous of the three, who I'm forgetting, but it'll come to me. I think John Chamberlain, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, maybe.
And so these three were anti-Eisenhower, as was Meyer. And Meyer, was pushing Robert Taft. La Follette wanted MacArthur, but the other ones wanted Taft as well. And they lose. And there's a board that's very pro-Eisenhower, but the editorial triumvirate, and with Meyer's encouragement, saying don't endorse Eisenhower under any circumstances, and they don't. And so when Eisenhower wins, that board gets very bold, and they fire the editorial triumvirate, and Meyer leaves with them. And the prime mover behind that is Henry Hazlitt. Henry Hazlitt wants them gone. And he says something to Time magazine to the effect that, this crowd, they're the type of people that think Joe McCarthy is a sacred character. And so out goes Meyer and his crowd. In comes Hazlitt and some others. And ironically, Billy Schlamm, James Burnham, Bill Buckley, the people that Meyer would later work, they come into the Freeman with Hazlitt, and Meyer leaves and goes to the American Mercury. And so it's in those years that he becomes more of a figure on the American right, a marginal figure at that time, because if you look at National Review, when National Review in 1954 and 1955, they were sending out prospectus. I have a prospectus from National Review saying these are the people that are going to be writing for National Review, and there's 40 people. Some of them are pretty obscure. They don't list Meyer. When Meyer makes his biggest splash in the conservative movement, when him and Frank Chodoroff kind of conspire, and they conspire on a hit piece against Russell Kirk, and I have their correspondence here. And Meyer writes this, and so Chodoroff, I should say, Chodoroff takes over from Hazlitt, takes over from the successor of Hazlitt at the Freeman, and has Meyer write this kind of hit piece on Russell Kirk. And Meyer's point is that Kirk has no sense of individual liberties, and the word freedom, you don't really see that in his books. And so he takes Kirk to task. At the same time, the Volcker Fund is looking at this, and they give him an extraordinary amount of money to write a book based on Meyer's attack, not just on Kirk, but on people that were called the New Conservatives at that time, Peter Viereck, and Neumer, the guy up at Cornell whose name's escaping me, but he writes this attack on them, and his name gets kind of big, kind of like you see online now when someone attacks a bigger person, they sort of get the rub and they get the bigger name. So Meyer, at that point, Russell Kirk was one of the biggest names on the American right, and here was Meyer taking him down. Now, I do have a lot of correspondence between him and Chodoroff, and also at the Hoover Institution, there's some great stuff from Kirk and Henry Regnery. And Kirk is saying, I have my spies. I know they're doing this. I know they're going to take me down. And I also heard that the Volcker Fund is funding a book that's going to attack me. And Henry Regnery said, well, what are you talking about, Russell? Who would publish that book? Who would ever publish that book? And lo and behold, Henry Regnery and Russell Kirk have a falling out, and Henry Regnery publishes that book. It changes a bit, but that book is what becomes In Defense of Freedom, which of course is the big book that Meyer's associated with. It's a slim book, but it's the book that if you talk about Frank Meyer with people now, the thing they're apt to remember is In Defense of Freedom, his book.
Hey, everybody, if you're a business owner or you run a team in a large company and you want to stop paying high prices for software, regain your digital sovereignty, and you want software that's flexible, you need to use Federated Computer. Federated Computer provides all the software you need for your business or team without the high prices, no creepy data collection, and total flexibility to use your software for your business goals. What's more, a typical Federated Computer customer saves $300 per month per employee. With Federated Computer, you get everything: email, calendar, groupware, file management, Office 365 documents, spreadsheets, presentations, video conferencing, group chat, CRM, databases, appointment management, and so much more. And they don't charge by the user. Instead, you pay a single low monthly price for your business. How does $120 per month for your whole business sound? And that's for everything. Tom Woods Show listeners have been saving big using Federated Computer. A dental practice reduced its monthly software costs by $7,000 per month. A construction firm saved so much money, they were able to hire a salesperson to increase sales. Tom Woods listener companies use Federated Computer to talk privately with each other without worrying conversations are going to end up part of some AI chatbot. No need to worry about change. Federated Computer customer support is there to help you every step of the way. I still don't understand the magic these guys must employ to make it all happen. Now, only for the Tom Woods audience, if you use code WOODS at checkout, you'll save even more, 30% off your first year. They even offer a free month to check things out. How do they do it? Federated Computer is run literally by the same people who invented cloud computing. These guys know their stuff. They enjoy empowering customers with tools to find success in their business. Do yourself a favor, take advantage of this offer now. Use code WOODS for 30% off your first year at federated.computer. Let's talk about a little bit later on some of Meyer's views about real life events, because it's not all just the ethereal discussion of abstract ideas, but he's also interested in current events and in politics and as you say, in foreign policy. So can you say something? Now, I realize this is unfashionable, but that makes it interesting. Can you say a little something about his opinions about the civil rights movement?
Well, when he was at the University of Chicago as a student in the 1930s, he was going to write his PhD dissertation on African Americans. And I have correspondence from him from when he was a soldier training in World War II saying, hey, our platoon is integrated and it works great. And I also have tens of thousands of his letters, and there's no animus whatsoever that he has towards African Americans. However, his view of the civil rights movement was very negative in the sense that ultimately he thought it was a form of blackmail where people were saying, do what we want or we're going to make a big ruckus. And he thought, gee, in a country that has the freedom of redressing grievances and has all these sort of governmental mechanisms to correct things, the idea that you're going to harass a private business or harass private people until you get what you want, he thought that was a form of blackmail. He also thought the idea that everyone was sort of naturally equal was, in the sense that everyone should have equality of opportunity, everyone should have equality of rights. But the idea that because you don't have equality of outcomes, that necessarily means a disparate treatment of different groups. He thought that was ridiculous. So he had a pretty dim view of Martin Luther King, and he had an even dimmer view of some of the King's rivals who were trying to push things further, faster.
And I suppose that was kind of a mainstream position for National Review at the time. National Review took that kind of position.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read the Tannenhouse book, but I know that he goes deep into Bill Buckley's sort of South Carolina wing of his family and the newspaper that they own and that kind of thing. There were articles in National Review that were, sort of in defense of the South. There were, what was the fellow's name? James J. Kirkpatrick from the Richmond News Leader. He was in National Review in those years, and he emerged from all that as sort of a mainline conservative figure. He was a very bright guy. It wasn't like he had a bunch of chewing tobacco dripping down his chin or something like that. So they did have some of that. Meyer came at it from a different perspective because he's a Jew from Newark, New Jersey, so he doesn't really have a dog in the fight. He came at it from a libertarian perspective. He talked about Eisenhower's invasion of Little Rock. he thought that this was an overreach by the federal government. A lot of what he wrote, it doesn't age well in 2025, but that's where he came down. And I think the thing that is probably shocking to a lot of mainline conservatives now is his argument in National Review on Abraham Lincoln with Harry Jaffa on the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination.
Oh, okay. Now, I had forgotten about this. I knew obviously about Harry Jaffa and, what's his name now? The guy, he was nominated for NIH director. Mel Bradford, yes. The Bradford and Jaffa debate. I read that, written about that. Did Meyer take more or less the Bradford view, or did he have his own particular take on it?
Well, Meyer's view was that Lincoln was the most authoritarian of American presidents, and that he basically paved the way for the New Deal, that he destroyed states' rights, and we became less of a country of states and more of a nation. And there was this back and forth in National Review that started from a 107-word book review that Meyer wrote. He wrote these books and briefs of a biography of Lincoln, where you can't really cram too much negative stuff in a 107-word book review. But he said something in passing about Lincoln being an authoritarian. That set off Harry Jaffa. They had this big fight in the magazine. I think they both drew blood. They both did pretty well. What's interesting is the letters that I found in that warehouse between Jaffa and Meyer, they're very friendly. So this is going on. And if you were to read this in National Review, you'd think these guys hate each other. But in reality, they're talking, Jaffa's saying we need to have a weekend bull session without interference from outsiders. We need to, talk all weekend and drink and all this kind of thing. And Meyer basically up in Woodstock, he had people come up, and Meyer stayed up all night. He slept during the day. And so people came up, they drank, they talked, they told stories. Sometimes Meyer could sort of declaim Shakespeare plays with people. He would do all sorts of things, and they'd just sit there all weekend. And that, there was this kind of a pilgrimage people made up Ohio Mountain Road in Woodstock to visit the Meyers in their farmhouses. In the 1960s, it really meant something different for people on the right to go to Woodstock than it meant for everyone else. Because what they meant is they would make this pilgrimage to the Frank Meyer's house on top or close to the top of this mountain in Woodstock, and they would spend the weekend drinking, eating, smoking, talking, having fun. And this was a rite of passage for a lot of people. And Jaffa was writing him saying, let's have one of those again.
Well, of course, that's how it should be, right? I'd like to live in a world in which that's the case. That
yes.
People have vigorous debates, but then, they like each other. They enjoy each other's company. They pursue it at their leisure. This seems like something from another planet today. We can't imagine this. It's, everything has to be a fight to the death and a some kind of tribal conflict between my side and your side. Because I think, like, with my own friends, I have disagreements, but we have fun talking about them. We don't end the friendship over them or denounce each other or anything like that. But that's the world. That's the world we have now.
Well, there was some of that world back in the 50s and 60s. Of course, someone like Russell Kirk, he had a harder time dealing with Meyer's criticisms. When Buckley went to him and said, because Kirk was a massive figure in 1955. He certainly was a bigger figure in 55 than 30-year-old William F. Buckley was. And so when Buckley went to him and said, we want you on the masthead of our magazine, Kirk resisted. And his reasoning, there's a lot of reasons why he may have resisted, but the reason he gave to Buckley is he said, how can I stand cheek by jowl with those two, meaning Frank Chodoroff and Frank Meyer, because they had this takedown of him in the Freeman. Kirk never really got over that slight from Meyer. They became a little bit, he softened a little bit. Frank ran something called The Exchange, which was kind of an early message board, which would line up conservative intellectuals, conservative academics with institutions that might hire them. And he'd do it anonymously because he didn't want to out anyone as a conservative in academia, even in the 1960s. And Kirk became one of the biggest pipelines for Meyer. Later, Kirk, when Meyer died, he said, when Frank Meyer was running Books, Arts, and Manners, they would always, they would review my books and they would have me as a reviewer. With regard to his replacements, they don't really review my books much and they don't really have me as a reviewer. So he came to appreciate Meyer more. Within National Review, the big feud was Meyer and Jim Burnham. And this is a very complex feud. A lot of people, put it to them both. They both were at Princeton, at least for a time, at the same time. They both were at Balliol College for a time at the same time. And they chalk this up to this sort of rivalry between the two of them. But, the fact of the matter is that nobody in the 800 or so year history of Balliol College had a better time there than Frank Meyer. The idea that he's dating the prime minister's daughter as he's simultaneously dating a whole bunch of other women, and he would be jealous of Jim Burnham at Balliol, that's ridiculous. So Gary Wills tried to make that point, but I think a lot of it goes to the fact that Meyer was a Stalinist, Burnham was a Trotskyist, and their personalities were very different. Meyer was very excitable. He was very, eager to kind of pounce. Burnham was very cool and lawyerly and detached. In fact, a lot of the people that I spoke to that worked at National Review for many years said I never really got to know that guy Burnham, whereas Meyer was more friendly. So Burnham could get Meyer going. He could get him mad very easily. He could get Meyer going from 0 to 60 in a matter of seconds. And I think he entertained himself doing that. And, some of these relationships, like with Kirk and Meyer wrote the thing about Kirk and he moved on. He could care less about it. It was Kirk who stewed about Meyer. With Burnham and Meyer, I think it was Meyer who stewed about Burnham.
Let's close with this. There's been a lot of controversy over the years about the idea of fusionism. That was Meyer's attempt to bring these two groups together. I think there are many grounds on which you can bring the two groups together. And I would say in parentheses, for people who say, well, libertarianism is neither left nor right. Now, what you're missing is the conservative worldview is that the structure of reality and the world is fixed. And there are institutions like the family that are fixed and that are not open to revision by, human, ingenuity. That's not how you create a livable order. You conform yourself to a natural order. You don't come up with some big 5-year plan to transform society or transform institutions or just any kind of radical Jacobin transformation of society is alien to the conservative. Now, for the libertarian, that's also unthinkable because it's all coercive. And so that right away shows there's much more commonality between libertarians and conservatives than between libertarians and a left wing that wants to do precisely those things. Radically transform society. You're not going to be able to radically transform society through bumper stickers and slogans. It's going to require some forcing people to do things. So anyway, having said that, a lot of times I see articles that talk about the alleged failure of fusionism, or it didn't work, or it never really took hold. But as a biographer of Frank Meyer, you may differ on that judgment, but I don't know. Where do you think it all comes down?
Well, I think, I think the revelation that I have with regard to fusionism in my book is that Frank came up with the idea as a communist. Frank was a Stalinist when he came up with fusionism. There was in the 1930s this big movement within communism where they had the slogan, communism is 20th century Americanism. It was during the Popular Front. And it was during a time when communism was probably most popular in this country, where you had leftists viewing communism as not so much an alien ideology, but as a sort of a more extension of the mainstream left. And some of them viewed that. Now, the moment they ally with Stalin, that all ends. And then a few years later, that no honor among thieves pact between Hitler and Stalin, that disintegrates very overnight with Operation Barbarossa. And the communists try to get back to that Popular Front, and they struggle with that. But they were allies of the United States during the Second World War. And during that time, Frank was trying to figure out a way to remain in the Communist Party because he had some doubts. He had doubts when he tried to join the army, and the communists said, no, don't go fight Hitler. You're more valuable here. He had doubts when he was in a squad bay, and he met men who didn't resemble the proletariat that Marx had described. This was a socially isolated guy who grew up in a fancy hotel in Newark, who went to Balliol College. He never met plumbers and carpenters and people like that. And the moment he meets them, he realizes, gee, the description of Marx of these people is not right. So he is fading out of communism. But he comes up with this idea of fusionism, and he writes a letter to Earl Browder. Earl Browder is the head of the Communist Party. And he says, if we're going to reach bowlers, if we're going to reach anyone beyond these sort of hardcore Marxists, we need to fuse communism, Marxism, with the American tradition. And we need to do this not just on the 4th of July, we need to do this every day of the year. And that's how we become more popular.
Hey gang, Old Woods here knows a guy you should know too, because I don't know about you, but I prefer to get my tax guidance from someone who hates the tax man with the same burning passion I do. And the great Matthew Sercely is a tax attorney who uses every one of his 812 IQ points to help liberty-minded folks just like you keep more of your money and stay out of trouble with the IRS. And by the way, yes, I said attorney, not CPA, which means your conversations with him are protected by attorney-client privilege. That is a very big deal, and you cannot get that kind of protection from your accountant. Another thing about Matt, he's one of us. He's been on my cruise. He's been at my murder mystery parties. He's listened to the Tom Woods Show since episode 3. He's a member of my elite mastermind. He's a real Woods OG. And Matt doesn't just do taxes. He builds strategies to legally starve the state. Entity structuring, income shifting, advanced planning. This is war by spreadsheet. If you're running a business or even thinking about one, you need someone like Matthew Sercely in your corner. He knows how to legally reduce your tax burden, structure your business the right way, and avoid trouble while keeping every dollar you're entitled to. Go to agorist.taxadvice.com/woods. That's AGORIST taxadvice.com/woods and grab your free Agorist Tax Toolkit. It's full of powerful tools and templates you can use to get your business in order, track your expenses, and reduce how much the IRS takes from you without crossing any lines. Again, that's agorist.taxadvice.com/woods. Take the first step to keeping what's yours.
Meyer is a very intelligent guy. He was an ideologue at that point, and some would argue he was an ideologue the whole time, but he was a very intelligent guy. So at a certain point, he's going to realize, well, Marxism doesn't fuse with the American tradition. What does? And that explains kind of the intellectual journey he was on for the rest of his life. And I think what he discovered would fuse with the American tradition is freedom, because the American founding, whether you're talking about the Declaration or the Constitution or the Washington's farewell address or the Federalist Papers, whatever you want to throw in there, the common denominator there is freedom. That's what was unusual about that vis-a-vis what was going on elsewhere in the world at the time. And I think that's what brings Frank to libertarianism. That and the fact that in 1945, during this weird period where Browder had essentially taken Meyer's advice, and you had a party. Browder was no longer called the general secretary. He was called the president of the communists. It was no longer the Communist Party. It was the Communist Political Association. They no longer played the International to start meetings. They played the Star-Spangled Banner. And Meyer, who had been director of the Chicago Workers' School, now they had places like the Jefferson School, the Sam Adams School in Massachusetts. So they were doing what Meyer had advised, which is to wrap themselves in the American flag. It just didn't work because Marx doesn't lend itself to that. At that time, Meyer was able to do something very odd, which probably was unprecedented in the history of the Communist Party. He wrote a review for New Masses, which was a communist-controlled publication of The Road to Serfdom. And it wasn't a negative review. I don't want to say it was a positive review, but Meyer gave Hayek a great deal of respect. And you can almost see the wheels going in Meyer's mind, having read The Road to Serfdom. And Meyer was at LSE at the same time that Hayek was there. They both got Rockefeller money at the same time at the London School of Economics. So he had known who Hayek was prior to that. But that book really hit him like a ton of bricks. And you can see him changing his mind in 1945. And ultimately, he changed it with fusionism. He changes his mind of what that means. He keeps the template, but he says, well, Marx doesn't fit here. What does? Conservatism fits. I think the reason why it succeeded was because, one, people could see it was very simple. At its distilled form, it's true. And I think the third reason is probably the most important, is because it did have political utility. The idea that you were going to take these two disparate camps, traditionalists, kind of proto kind of moral majority types maybe, and link them up with freedom types, libertarians and other people, and say, hey, you guys are together. You guys aren't in conflict. You're in cooperation. That worked. It worked from Goldwater through Reagan. And I don't know at what point it ceased being kind of influential, but obviously if you look at the political landscape today, it's not as though fusionism is having the influence on people that it did, say, in 1970 or 1980. I mean, you could look at Ronald Reagan and say, well, gee, he is Frank Meyer's sort of fusionist, the embodiment of what he wanted. He's his fusionist dream. And Meyer, in fact, predicted Reagan. In 1960, he wrote a memo to his fellow National Review editors and said, listen, you can't endorse this guy Nixon under any circumstances. You can't endorse Nelson Rockefeller. Let's not endorse anyone. We may have to wait 20 years before we elect one of our own. It may be until 1980 that we elect one of our own. That's how much work we have to do. Maybe there's a crisis before then and we get to elect our own guy, but it's probably going to be 20 years before we elect our own guy. And of course, Frank didn't get to see it, but even in 1964, he was touting Reagan as the next big thing. And so he was an early embracer of Ronald Reagan. And when Reagan came into office, he gave sort of a hat tip nod to Frank at the first CPAC. So Reagan was aware of Meyer and, very much should have put into place his fusionist principles. And Meyer, of course, was very much aware of Reagan.
Well, it's a very worthwhile book, as I say, especially for those of us who care about all these ideas. The intersection of the conservative and libertarian movements has been very great over the years. Frank Meyer had a lot of valuable things to say, even if I don't agree with all his political judgments. I remember I learned a lot from him, especially when I was just a young college student trying to find my way intellectually. I found Frank Meyer's work to be absolutely invaluable. So, folks, I highly recommend Daniel J. Flynn, the man who invented conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer, just released for your intellectual pleasure. Dan, thanks so much for your time.
Tom, thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.